During his time in DG Comp, he established the gold standard for European enforcement of the law, a standard that that Vice President Vestager has adhered to very closely, another gold standard keeper. And the day after that dinner, he got up on the dais in Oxford and he exploded that debate by quietly saying that he had concluded that his 2001 decision to import the neoliberal consumer welfare philosophy from the US to Europe had been bad for Europe. In recent weeks, Prime Minister Monti has taken on the role of a lion defending European sovereignty, including in two roaring op-eds in Politico, which I encourage every one of you to read. The key takeaway, Europe has all the power it needs to fully protect its democracy, and today's leaders have all the power they need and all the wisdom they need and all of the duty and responsibility they need to do that. Anyway, Mario Monti.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barry. I hope you can hear me well. You have been very kind in introducing me. I will try to be concise in my initial remarks by saying the following. President Trump's America has two faces. One, the most visible, is assertive and sometimes aggressive in the use of power, perhaps of force. The other face is less visible, is one of abdication. Abdication from leadership, from the position that the US held leading the West and in many respects the global community for 80 years. Europe nowadays, understandably, is very uncomfortable and it feels forced to play on the defensive. I believe that if Europe were more self-confident in itself and in the like-mindedness that it has with so many countries in the world, it would also be better equipped to cope with the more threatening phase of the US. What do I mean? All of a sudden, we have an ideology, a politics, and a set of policies emanating from Washington, which I respect, which discard some key principles that we were taught by the US more than by anybody else. The rule of law, open markets, the clear distinction of powers and responsibilities between the economic power and political power, the existence of and respect for independent authorities, the need for a multilateral governance of the global economy, in particular to take care of the increasingly needed public goods, such as health, climate, and even security. Now, all that seems to be abandoned by the US, but I believe that this intellectual and political abandonment is not shared by many countries in the world. And therefore, the Europeans should, I believe, leverage on the stance, which has nothing anti-American, nothing at all. On the contrary, it can be presented as the interest in preserving the huge legacy that the US gave to all of us by federating mentally, by exploiting the like-mindedness that there is among countries which are not ready to abandon the rule of law and all the other things that I mentioned. neither in the conduct of their domestic affairs nor in the efforts to manage the global economy multilaterally. This is, I believe, a very widespread attitude in many countries. I'm not speaking of setting up a new union or a structured organization, but some sort of soft but frank link of mindsets and inspirations of statements and of policies, so that no one of the countries which are not ready to give up all that feels alone. I see that many countries would be ready to inscribe themselves morally in this set of the like-minded. Maybe not the European Union. You might be surprised to hear me say this. Maybe not the European Union, because the European Union has to move unanimously on such matters. And I'm not sure that 2 or 3 of the member states of the EU would be ready to proclaim themselves as defendants of liberal democracies, because that is what it is. For example, Prime Minister Orban is on the record as having said that he defends his own form of illiberal democracy. But most countries of the European Union, I think, would be ready to share the position I'm mentioning. So I'm sure it would be the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, several Asian or African or Latin American countries. This should not be a matter of global North versus global South, least of all a collection of anti-Americans. On the contrary, the day will come, perhaps, that such a alliance, open at any instant in time to Washington, would have Washington again among its big promoters. But in the meantime, many points on the global agenda could be addressed in a coordinated way, hoping to have as much as possible the consensus also of the US administration on points like how to manage the existing international institutions, for them not to neglect the existence of a climate problem, of a public health problem, and so on and so forth. But one could say, well, this implies that one keeps some faith on the fundamental positives of having a liberal democracy and a rule of law. That's right. That's right. I do personally stick to that position. And I realize that these days one might be tempted to say, well, but don't be naive. In the competition among power states that will profile the next years and decades, perhaps the time of democracies has gone, and the fact of being an authoritarian state, an autocratic state, puts a state in a huge position of comparative advantage. Well, I thought of this, but I'm not sure this is the case. For example, when a number of countries acting together, using the merits of democratic capitalism and the power of attractions of that, using the alliance transatlantically, were able to favor the demise of the USSR, of the Soviet Union. Well, all of those were liberal democracies. The two leaders, in a sense, were a Republican US president, Ronald Reagan, and a conservative British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And the US, in that phase, was very closely coordinated with a number of European countries of different political colors at that time. And together they put a coalition of democracies, not trying to export democracy. That experiment 20 years later would have failed, but trying to exercise the appeal of democracies on those who do not yet benefit of it. So let's not be pessimistic about the powers, the soft powers of democracies and more generally of states which intend to abide to the rule of law. When it comes to competition, Barry, you refer to one of my past activities as the EU Competition Commissioner. I was perplexed, I must tell you, initially when I was invited to this very important event by the Open Market Institute. Somewhat superficially, I found myself asking myself, well, democracy and open market, I see some common points, but are those enough to justify that an Open Market Institute has such an ambitious project on democracy? Yes, my answer is positive, and you are right. Because after all, ladies and gentlemen, democracy is not against power. Democracy is for the legitimate acquisition of power, of political power, through elections. But democracy, liberal democracy, does not like and even opposes the abuse of political power, taking the shape of those democratically elected to pretend to overwhelm the barriers, the limitations that the respective constitutions have given to each executive power in the different countries. Isn't that very, very similar, I submit, to what we witness in the economic, not the political market? And isn't the job of one of the jobs of an antitrust authority to not to be against large companies, even dominant companies, if that dominant position has been acquired legally in conformity with the rules? But the competition authority has the duty and the remit to stand against the abuse of dominant position in Europe or against monopolization in the US. So if there is such an affinity between people who love democracy and people who exercise or have exercised the function of protecting the economic aspects of democracy, and I was privileged to be able to hear some time ago the remarks by Margarete Vestager, I found that a very practical and understandable treatise in democracy and competition. And so I of course, support the European Union when it takes decision in the area of competition. Individual decisions may also always be wrong. There are the courts to take care of that. But as I wrote in one of my recent Politico articles, President Trump has no reason whatsoever to complain about the fine for abuse of dominant position to Google recently adopted by the Commission. That was simply an application of what also the US antitrust authorities do on the market, which is their jurisdiction. And I also remember that when we acted against Microsoft 20 years ago, one of the most fervent supporters of the inquiry of the Commission on Microsoft was Eric Schmidt, then the CEO of a 3 or 4 old internet startup called Google.